In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanisms of signaling from hormone receptors. Here we're going to focus on membrane receptors, so receptors that the hormone binds to on the surface of a cell, where the hormone never actually enters the target cell. There are three types of pathways that we're going to focus on. Two pathways that signal through cyclic AMP, one pathway that increases cyclic AMP levels, and one pathway that decreases cyclic AMP levels. The third pathway signals through calcium ions. Each of these pathways uses G protein coupled receptors, but the G proteins in each pathway are a little bit structurally different. Those structural differences allow the G protein to activate different enzymes. So for the pathway that increases cyclic AMP levels, that uses a GS protein. For the pathway that decreases cyclic AMP levels, that uses a GI protein. And the pathway that uses calcium, that increases calcium levels in the cell, uses a GQ protein. For the most part, each of these pathways is triggered by different hormones. Epinephrine and norepinephrine is an exception to this, though. Epinephrine and norepinephrine can actually trigger any one of these three pathways. It just depends on what receptor the hormone is interacting with. So different epinephrine, norepinephrine receptors use different pathways. So let's get into the actual pathways themselves. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. I'm just going to cover things at the level that I want you guys to be familiar with. The first pathway I'm going to go over is the pathway where you get increased cyclic AMP levels in the target cell. First, let's draw our target cell plasma membrane. Now let's draw the hormone receptor. I draw the receptor that way, like a snake passing through the membrane, because we know that these hormone receptors they're called transmembrane receptors. They cross the plasma membrane, so they have a piece of the receptor that's on the outside of the cell and a piece of the receptor that's on the inside of the cell. There's the outside portion, there's the inside portion. So when a hormone binds to the outside portion of the receptor, that can cause the whole receptor to kind of shift in shape and cause a change in shape down here on the internal part of the receptor. And it's this internal part of the receptor that's actually coupled to the G protein. So since we're talking about the pathway that increases cyclic AMP levels, this is a GS protein. Now, when the hormone binds the receptor, the GS protein gets activated, and that activated GS protein, in turn, goes and activates an enzyme that's embedded in the plasma membrane, and this enzyme is called Adenylate Cyclase. Adenylate cyclase takes molecules of ATP and converts them to cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP acts as the second messenger, and what cyclic AMP does is it activates enzymes called protein kinases. Protein kinases are enzymes that add a phosphate group onto other proteins. And adding that phosphate group onto other proteins changes the activity of those proteins, which means that activating protein kinases leads to a change in cell activity. The target cell's response to that hormone. A lot of hormones use this cyclic AMP pathway. You have epinephrine and norepinephrine. Some of the receptors, specifically the beta receptors that epinephrine and norepinephrine can bind to, use this pathway. You also have calcitonin, parathyroid hormone, antidiuretic hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone. All of these use this particular signaling pathway in their target cells. The next signaling pathway that you find in target cells is a pathway that leads to a decrease in cyclic AMP. Once again, you have your plasma membrane. Once again, you have your membrane receptor with both its extracellular, and intracellular region. And this receptor is coupled to a GI protein. So when the hormone binds to this receptor, the GI protein gets activated. Only this G protein activates an enzyme called phosphodiesterase. And phosphodiesterase takes cyclic AMP and gets rid of the cyclic part, cleaves that cyclic bond, leaving you with just AMP. So since cyclic AMP is getting converted to AMP, the levels of cyclic AMP are going down. And as the levels of cyclic AMP go down, you get reduced activity of the protein kinases we mentioned in the last slide. And you get generally reduced enzyme activity overall in the target cell. Not a lot of hormones use this pathway. In fact, really, it's only some receptors of epinephrine and norepinephrine, specifically the alpha-2 receptors. The third category of membrane receptor signaling in the endocrine system is the pathway that leads to an increase in intracellular calcium. In this pathway, again, we have our plasma membrane. Again, we have our receptor. And again, this receptor is coupled to a G protein, but the G protein in this pathway is GQ. When a hormone binds this type of receptor, that G protein activates an enzyme located at the inner surface of the plasma membrane. This enzyme is called phospholipase C. If you take a look at the name, the activity of this enzyme is right there in the name. Phospholipase is an enzyme that cleaves phospholipids. Phospholipase C acts on a particular phospholipid that you find on the inner surface of the plasma membrane called PIP2. So there's the phosphate head, here's the lipid tails of that phospholipid. And when phospholipase C acts on PIP2, PIP2 gets separated into just the just the lipid tails and the phosphate head. The lipid tails are a molecule called DAG, which stands for diacylglycerol, but it's okay if you just remember DAG. And the phosphate head portion is called IP3. IP3 stands for inositol triphosphate, but IP3 is fine. Both DAG and IP3 contribute to a rise in intracellular calcium, mostly coming from stores tucked away within organelles, like the endoplasmic reticulum. This intracellular calcium activates a molecule called calmodulin. So calmodulin is just a calcium-responsive molecule within a cell. And calmodulin activates other enzymes, and that enzyme activation leads to a change in cell activity. Again, the target cell's response to the hormone. There are a few different hormones that signal through this pathway. For the third time, we have epinephrine and norepinephrine, this time acting through alpha-1 receptors. We also have oxytocin, and many of the hormones of the hypothalamus. All act through this pathway through phospholipase C, leading to an increase in intracellular calcium. That's it for membrane receptor signaling.